Okay, live and direct. So the broadcast from Tuesday was from a year ago, and we're actually a day ahead. So that was review, which is not entirely a bad thing. But I made references to that in that broadcast to a couple of things that I'm going to show you now that I already put up on the Moodle site. So even though we're talking about the drugs, it's useful to, some people learn better in stories. And so one of your classmates came in earlier and during office hours, and I said, he said, explain to me the biopsychosocial. So here's how that works. Biopsychosocial recon. Now, that model is referred to in Rasmussen is basically a paragraph long, which unless you can decode technical English, doesn't necessarily give you instructions. Okay? This is preparing you for a real-world event in the field. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychological Association, DSM-5, right, gives a catalog of all mental illnesses and addictions, so people get a diagnosis, right, which might describe certain problems and behaviors, but does not describe what the solutions are. So here's how we go. So the simplex skill, that is the simple skill being developed, is the biological effect of the substances or processes. So if you know what the drugs are doing to the person, you can also kind of decode what emotions the person is going through while on the drugs. Because drugs are feelings. Because basically all the drugs are doing is mimicking chemicals that your brain and body make anyway. Right? Caffeine's a stimulant. Raises blood pressure, increases blood sugar. And also has a component within the plant that's a naturally occurring opiate. Okay, which is a painkiller. So you feel good on it. Mood elevation, raised blood sugar. They usually sweeten it with something or another. Boom, boom, boom. Then if you don't have it, you start going into withdrawal and you get a headache. You feel down and depressed, etc., etc. It's a drug, right? So, what would happen if somebody did that? So, the psychological effects of the processes or substances. So, one of the things that DSM has now incorporated is the whole issue of brain reward, which is something that we learned in the late 20th century and began to incorporate. That gambling isn't technically a drug, but it gives you a rush. Video games aren't technically a drug, but they give you a rush. And if you don't do them, you have a withdrawal, which is a little depression, etc., etc. So the brain reward system is being engaged. So broadly speaking, two types of addiction. Things you take into your body that alter your blood chemistry or your brain chemistry, or things you do with your body and mind that engage the same brain reward system without doing external taking chemical. Yeah.
You think combat vets coming back from extended tours in extreme measures would, after a certain period of time, develop a recessed feeling of emotion or life?
Yes.
And need to deal with that in some way, shape, or form like that?
I would rephrase it differently. So, for example, let's take a movie like The Hurt Locker. Okay? Dudes defusing bombs. Danger. Wow, I could die instantly. Boom. And, it's a puzzle. And, I'm highly trained. And I actually kind of get off on doing this. And it's danger. It's a rush. And then if you saw that movie, okay, what are they doing? They're drinking fifths of vodka afterwards and getting into fights with each other. Then going out on another call. Until when he gets rotated back, shopping with his wife and kid at Winco or whatever is not a rush. Unless you've got a PTSD thing going where if you were in an IED attack, improvised explosive device attack, and it was triggered by a car, coming into the parking lot at LCC is a trigger for you. Because you can't stand being next to a line of cars. Because it triggers you. Because of that traumatic memory. So combat itself is not only a traumatic memory, but oftentimes, particularly with, and this is the point I was trying to make with Eduardo Duran's analysis of what meth is and why you look at the history of a drug, basically, it was used for combat. So that you're in a life-threatening situation, but you don't care because you're getting off on the rush. And it's like a drug high, whether you're on a drug high or not. So, yeah. Your nervous system would entrain to particular situations. Back to slide, please. Thanks. All right, so the psychological effects of the processes or substances, and finally the social supports for addiction and recovery. So, biological, what's happening physically, and how is that affecting what is happening with the rest of the being? And you write that down basically as a story. What are they telling you? What drugs are they doing? When did they start? How did it make them feel?
So that's where your 4 to 6 pages is coming in. Is where you're asking the person basically how they started,
Yes.
what it makes them feel like, and what they're taking, and
different agencies do this different ways. I used to start in high school by saying, okay, look up on the shelf. Here's drugs A to Z. If you had your favorites, what would they be? And they'll tell you. But then part of the history might be, okay, let's start with alcohol. First use of alcohol. On your own. How much, and then how much now? When did you first start using? Then barbiturates, then cocaine, then depressants, then ecstasy, drugs A to Z. Z at least. Tobacco. This is the actual form. I can actually bring it in, show you.
so speaking of forms, I kind of went into my computer and did a little outline thing of just what the information you wanted, and I just need to plug in the information. But then the 4 to 6 pages you were asking for, I just do that on the story part of it, right?
The entire 4 to 6 pages is the whole story.
The whole thing.
Right? So the biopsychosocial model basically developed in the latter part of the 20th century. So the biological, what's happening physically to their body as a result of the drugs. And what's happening to the rest of them. Psychologically, what's happening as a result of the addictive process psychologically and emotionally. Now, in the original use of the term psychology, it literally means study of the soul. Ology, study of psyche, the soul. But in Western psychology, it means study of the mind, and we don't really talk about the soul because Freud thought that religion is a form of insanity. But he was a crackhead, so kind of discount that. But what we would say psychologically now is what you think and what you feel and what you believe. What you've been taught. Okay, a person who's been bullied wants to be like the popular kids. What are the popular kids doing? So what is happening as a result of the addictive process psychologically and emotionally? What neurochemical systems are being affected? Which would mean you'd have to know what the chemicals are, and we'll be talking about that. Serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, right. All that. Therefore, what emotions are being generated and or suppressed as a result of use. if cocaine directly simulates the feeling that your brain, the brain state of having achieved something or won something, and you feel like a loser, cocaine would compensate for that. A lot of times people who've been traumatically brain injured will do methamphetamine because it makes them feel competent. Of course, it's damaging their brain, but you'll find that with people who've been TBI'd. They'll use. Of course, it's not helping their brain, but they want to feel competent because they've lost something. Yeah.
Do you maybe have a example of what a paper like this would look like, or could you direct us to one? Because we know all the questions to answer, but how are we supposed to, like, is it supposed to be dialogue? I don't really get how we're supposed to lay it out, you know?
I'll show you. It'll be coming up. What are the problems to which addiction are the answer? See, addiction is a purpose. There's a purpose behind every addiction. It's goal-oriented. Addictions are goal-oriented. So what's the goal in using or engaging in the behavior? Yeah?
To get more of the drug?
Could be to get
Or
more.
the effect of it?
Or to get more of the effect of it, or
if you were a meth user, the adrenaline, or the energy to clean the house, or
there's that, right?
do your work.
Mm-hmm.
Or some people.
And you also have to answer that from the client's point of view, because they will tell you too. What are the healthy pro-social coping skills that need to be taught to substitute for the addictive process? They probably don't know that. And you are developing that. One of the challenges with this, I understand this is hard because it's basically occurring in a box that the client for sure did not know they were in. And you're basically asking them to get out of that box and show them how boxes are manufactured so they can at least either choose to live in the box or get out of it. But usually especially if they're in corrections is saying, no, you need to be out of this box, or we're going to put you in a smaller box and keep you there. And some people like that, but I'm trying to say, look, you need to move out of this box. So this is where the social part comes in. What are the societal or social structures outside of the person supporting the addiction? That's why we started, for example, with a social recon. I mean, many of you talked about, wow, I had no idea that advertising had this effect. Well, right. Why didn't you notice that? Because you're taught not to see it. But it still affects you. Now, you can't say the Super Bowl made me do it, but, I mean, they're not spending billions of dollars, $300,000 for a 30-second placement for nothing.
Right.
They have to do it because it works. So those are certain social structures that could include the family. What are the social networks the person exists in which support the addiction? Client came in, yesterday. Talked about being homeless in certain cities where he was required to use. because they don't trust him unless he's using with them. And these people are armed, so you got to do that. And part of street organizations. So, how do you survive, right? Social networks. So we try and have them change their social networks. What are the social networks a person needs to create or participate in to support recovery? If you're seeing for them for the first time, they're probably not ready to hear this yet. But you have to have it in your mind. Where are we going to? Because if you have an extended relationship with them in your agency, relapse is going to happen. It's not inevitable, but it's predictable given what the drugs have done to their neurochemistry. If methamphetamine literally physically destroys the part of your brain that's the brakes, and they're going on a downhill slide with no brakes, they gonna continue sliding. Unless you apply a force that makes them stop. And that might not be incarceration, because don't kill me system, there are drugs available in prison. Don't kill me, please. People have been killed for talking about that. Wish I was paranoid about that, but head of the prison system was killed in this state for trying to reveal that guards were bringing in dope.
Oh my gosh.
And they get money for it.
Huh.
It's an incentive. They get lots of money for it.
Yes. So, what are the culturally appropriate recovery frameworks necessary for treatment and recovery? That's not necessarily in the original biopsychosocial model, but practitioners have put it in. It's part of our ethical code to look at cultural competency. So the culturally appropriate recovery frameworks might not be from their native culture. Their native culture might not have recovery frameworks. So you might have to import them from somewhere else, which means you'd have to know about them. And this is also the tricky part with doing this recon, this assignment, because it requires you thinking outside of the box, creatively.
I think one of the things that's kind of hard is because it's a fictitious thing. I mean, it could be a real thing. You could go do it, but you're saying it could be fictitious, and having to create the agency, create the person, and to know that person you created to get the info from. It's just.
If you're not used to using your imagination, it's a muscle, and this is just lifting. Use your imagination muscle. That's all. The reason I'm doing this is not to torture you. I had to do this. My classroom training failed people. Failed people. There was no answer. And they kept coming. So we had to find a real world answer that worked for this person right now, on the spot. And I'll show you what that looks like a little later. Okay? So, review from the absence. All right, that rebroadcast was essentially review. I'll give you the two cases I referred to in it, Carmen Brightrobe and Tony Soprano. Then we'll look at DSM-5 and the drugs. All right? So I started with Carmen and Tony because at the time of presentation, okay, this is counselor speak, presentation, which means when they first showed up, what they presented with. Okay, so you understand in the counseling relationship, your first meeting is strangers. And here's my standard of reference. In Western psychology, they teach you that you have the counseling session is a 50-minute hour, You're meeting with them one-on-one, asking them open-ended questions and reframing and blah, 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 for 15 minutes, and you have 10 minutes to write it up. Yeah, and then this is what we'll work on in our next session, et cetera, right? So they're assuming that you have a 50-minute hour with these folks. There are certain populations, okay, that are high context, meaning they're reading your subliminals, your body language, your tone of voice, whether you make eye contact, your presentation. High context cultures tend to be women, minorities, people who have been in gangs, criminals. You got 30 seconds to make an impression with them. Or you lost them. 30 seconds. Not no 50-minute hour. So you best to be real. And get down to life and death stuff, the scary stuff. Show you know where it's at. You know, guy I talked to the other day, basically, I don't know if I should be sharing. Go ahead. Well, I ran into a situation with police corruption. No. Just like that. No. Really? And just, yeah, right. Of course. And you tried to report this crime that your boss was doing, and unfortunately, I said, no disrespect. Did you graduate high school? No. Okay. So when somebody's a government contractor and defrauding the government, the place you don't report that is the IRS. Right? You go to the military directly. But if this person is connected, politically connected with the cops, et cetera, you just lost your job. And you just exposed widespread systemic corruption. And if you live in a small town, they're going to mess with you. And they did. So he left. Right? So that's real. That's not paranoia. That's not Hollywood. That's real. You deal with corruption at all levels of the system. You still have to have people make a healthy adjustment. Whatever they're doing, okay? So the presentation, what they presented with, this is the story that they trust you with, or the part of the story they trust you with at the initial meeting. It might not be the whole story. In fact, assume that it is not. That they're going to reveal it to you in layers as they trust you. Okay? So, presented with. They were basically those clients were alcohol, which is the first drug that we've talked about, really. So I just started because they're real, these Tony and Carmen are real simple, okay? Basically alcohol with a pharma overlay, in Tony's case, but cultural factors reinforcing their problem. So this is what I'm talking about with the biopsychosocial being a story. You start with a story, and then you break it down into clinical language and then be able to translate it. Because they're not talking to you in clinical language. This is my life. I may have gotten a diagnosis, but I don't know what it means. You have to know what it means, or at least what the person giving them the diagnosis means. Right?
And they're talking about pharmaceuticals, so alcohol.
Yeah, well, we'll see. You'll see. Okay? You'll see how they fit in with the new DSM criteria, which acknowledges brain reward as a factor in addiction, can also include addictive processes which also stimulate brain reward. Okay, so brain reward is simply, that feels good, or that relieves pain, let's do it again. And there are parts of your brain that are hardwired to do that. How many are your moms? Okay, so, all right, you go through labor, real painful, then you swear you're never to do it again, and you forget that, right? But you remember the nurturing and all the other kind of stuff, and so that's a powerful instinct, okay? There's brain reward with that. Cocaine can override that. That's what makes crack so dangerous. Cocaine can override the mother's protective and nurturing instinct because it basically says, oh, that's all taken care of. You need me more than the baby. Yeah.
Isn't any drug like that, though? I
Many
mean, not
drugs
just-
are, yes.
Not just cocaine,
Right. Cocaine in particular.
anything that feels good and, you know.
So, following is up in Moodle, already is supplemental. Tale of two clients. Carmen Brightrobe, who's a 50-something, heterosexual, Hep C positive, Native American woman, the alcoholic in recovery. Okay, that's what she's presenting with. Anthony Soprano, 30-something Italian American, DUII client, dual diagnosis. Okay, so that is any addiction with a mental illness. All right, so dual diagnosis. So he's diagnosed with anxiety disorder, and he's an alcohol abuser. So Carmen first. So Carmen was infected with Hep C as an IDU, an injectable drug user, as a teenager in Oregon. The infection, usually this happens when people are sharing needles. So she was using meth, okay, on the res or something. Sharing needles, and the infection progressed undetected for 30 years. All right, so we weren't doing HIV or other outreach to the reservation in particular then, 30 years ago. All right, so that's a case of systemic neglect. That's one piece. There's no health care or scientific literacy to know we don't share needles, or maybe you should get tested or whatever, right? So the infection progressed undetected for 30 years. She did not use alcohol at all until the suicide of her husband. 2 days after the death of her husband, she was also diagnosed with a near-terminal case of Hep C. All right? Your husband kills himself. 2 days later, you go to the doctor because you have some symptoms. They do a blood draw. They test for viruses. Oh, you have a near-terminal case of Hep C. Because this has been going on for 30 years. What did you do? What was your family history? What, blah, blah, blah. Oh, I shot speed, shared needles 30 years ago, but not since then. And didn't really drink at all until, my husband killed himself and I didn't know how to cope with it. This is what she's presenting with now. Right? Okay? So, near terminal, what this means is she cannot be injured because she will bleed out. Any kind of injury. Because she has no clotting factor in her blood because of liver damage. So your ability to clot, unless, you are, what's that blood disease? It's genetic, one white people, hemophilia, right? So you don't have a clotting factor made by your liver, but she had it, but it was destroyed by the Hep C virus. So she can't get hurt. Or she'll die. This is 2 days after the suicide of her husband. She found that out, and the shock of her husband's death and this, neither of which resulted in a referral to grief counseling or crisis counseling by either a doctor or a healthcare worker or the police that brought her the news of her husband's suicide. So, culturally speaking, all right, she's Native American, but let's erase that for a second. If this had happened to you, what are the supports in your culture that help you cope with that?
Your family. And
Okay, your family, but she didn't mention them, so let's say that they're not a factor. Because that's a question you'd ask, right? What about your family? I'm alone.
You need to go to group.
Okay. What group where? I'm not putting you on the spot.
No,
but
yeah. You'd have to research and know the answers to
you'd
those
have to
questions.
know that up front, right? No referral from any of the sources that are supposed to give her referral. None from the police, none from the docs that gave her the diagnosis, none from the crisis counselors that she could have been referred to because your husband kill you, if that it kills himself, is that a crisis?
Should have been first.
Yeah, okay. I mean, so none of that. None of that. And we're talking within 100-mile radius of here. Okay? Willamette Valley.
Recently? I mean, like.
Yeah.
Oh my
I'm
gosh.
talking about the last, let's say I've been here 23 years. So let's just say in the last 10 or 15. I changed her name, but she was I have a television show that's an interview show. She was one of my interview guests. This is the story she told. So yeah, I changed her name, but she's already been broadcast. You can see it on YouTube. Okay, this happened in the last decade. Okay, so what she did, she binged on alcohol, drove herself home, hit a pedestrian who lived, and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. That was her first offense. Treatment in prison consisted of an offer of meds. In prison.
Meds fix everything.
Meds fix everything, right. Okay? This is what she presents with.
Night antidepressants, is it?
Huh?
Night
Yeah, probably. Xanax or something like that. Wellbutrin, whatever. Yeah, I guess she's depressed after,
Maybe.
yeah, all this. Maybe a little bit. Kinda. Right? So, while in prison, she was allowed to begin doing Native American sweat lodge ceremonies, which began an exploration of native-based recovery technologies, the well-variety movement, etc. Okay, so because of her medical condition, she has to be aware of her viral status, as well as being able to do grief and to grieve and heal properly, which also, of course, affects her immune status, too. Right, so that information, she's presenting with, and we help support doing that.
So what, I'm sorry, what'd you say about the immune status?
So remember, when I first kind of demonstrated, like using myself as a photo reverse, I am a 59-year-old maroon male, heterosexual, what's your infection status? Like, you want to check if they know. Like, so I haven't talked about Gary yet, except, I actually didn't mention Gary. So HIV positive, logger from Pendleton, right? So what's your viral load? What's your infection status? Oh, I'm HIV positive. Okay. What's your viral load? Well, what's that? That's how many virus particles you have in, X amount of blood. Like, how bad is the infection? What's your T cell count? You usually ask T cell count first. How much of an immune system do you have? Okay, if it's below 200, that's HIV. Well, you've got AIDS. It's above 200, okay? You're positive, but you still have an immune system. The body's still fighting it off. So viral load of, let's say Carmen has 200. Then you also get a viral load for HIV. Yeah, how many virus particles in? So Hep C, she was, let's say, 200,000, which is low for Hep C. So you have to know that for each disease, too. That's what I'm saying in terms of the scientific literacy. This stuff, we've had to get sophisticated because these behaviors, if 85% of the HIV positive population got infected under the influence because they were never taught to have sex sober, duh, right, we got to get into their sex lives because it's intimately connected, not intimately connected with what they use and how they use, and whether they know what their infection status is. Okay? Okay? The ability, because of psychoimmunology, hi Cottage Grove. Because of psychoimmunology, what that means is, psychoneuroimmunology, what that means is your mood affects your immune response. You're upbeat, your immune response is up. You're depressed, it goes down. You ask me how I was doing? Well, if I feel good enough to have attitude, I'm good. Okay, so this means also being able to process grief, anger, shame without relapsing. And this is the thing you want to look at. Anniversary dates. When did something happen? Is it an anniversary? Again, not just the exact date anniversary, but around the time, like a month on either side, if it was a major event like that. And other triggers, yeah.
So we're basically supposed to start from where they began using drugs or alcohol?
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
You can briefly mention that. Yeah. When they started using regularly, there's certain thresholds you cross, like if you understand that smoking any white dope is the same as shooting it, and that's an immediate hospital admission. That's inpatient protocol. Immediately. Smoking weed generally doesn't get you put in the hospital unless you have a psychotic break behind it, which happens with some people. People get paranoid on weed. Some folks. Anyway. All right, so she does generic 12-step AA meetings. She also does powwows. Native Sweats is considering TP meetings as well as exercising, and she also paints. TP meetings means peyote.
What's powwow?
Powwow is basically a people putting on regalia, which is basically traditional native, I call it regalia because it's not a costume, they're not play acting, they're basically, reenacting certain traditions and doing dances to drumming, etc. Ours got snowed out this year, but they happen from time to time.
She's gonna be doing peyote, is that the TP thing?
TP meeting is peyote, yeah.
And that's not gonna affect with her sobriety at all?
No. Well, depends on whose framework. She's native. She's a tribal member. She's not a drug counselor, but even if she was a drug counselor, it's actually protected by federal law for her to do that.
Only her, because she's Native American.
Or if you're part of Native American church.
But if it makes her feel really good, what if she
Well,
wants to do more
understand
TP
what's
meetings?
happening in a TP meeting. It's like, this would be different. So nobody eats peyote to get high. I
would
mean,
know.
yes, it is a norepinephrine psychedelic. Yes, that is true. But in Western pharmacology, it's not an addictive drug. Okay? So it produces, by augmenting norepinephrine, in a similar way that ecstasy does, okay, but more powerful in terms of the psychedelic, meaning you augment consensus reality. That is, so for example, if we were outside, I was on peyote, I would see energy moving up the tree and dumping into the atmosphere. Now, the fact that every tree is already dumping 200 gallons of water into the air, is that a hallucination, or am I picking up on something that's happening outside of my senses?
Picking up.
Okay, so in their framework, they don't have teepee meetings except for to pray for healing for specific people who may or may not be in the meeting. So you don't enter a teepee at sunset, have a water break at midnight, and then sit until dawn for fun. That ain't recreational high. Okay, and part of the ritual is also you throw up because peyote is emetic. It makes you, have nausea as part of the experience, which is incorporated within the experience. There are very few Americans that want to feel uncomfortable as part of their religious experience. Americans are way into their comfort. So within this framework, since the use of this particular sacrament predates America, it's not getting high and it doesn't violate her sobriety. But again, our friend Al Smith, who was a drug counselor, had 40 years sobriety, went to a peyote meeting in California, told his boss when he got back, and they fired him for violating his sobriety. Now, he's full-blood Klamath. His use of peyote was protected by federal law, but not in Oregon. So, famous landmark case that goes to the Supreme Court, comes back, and then, a legislator says, look, that's ridiculous. Okay, if you're part of Native American church and you're a drug counselor, here's a defense, okay? This is religious expression. First Amendment guarantees you that. Oregon is a little behind the times. Because, again, there has never been a peyote addiction problem because there is no such thing as peyote addiction. Okay? Being Schedule 1 with heroin, there's never been a public health problem with peyote. It's simply suppression of a sacrament used by Native Americans. Period. It's not a pharmacological danger. All right. So, TP meetings would be allowed with her because she's a civilian, anyway, not a drug counselor. She just has to worry about whether throwing up causes her any bleeding, et cetera, which, yeah.
And this was while she was in jail for the 4 years?
No.
Or afterwards?
We don't do TP meetings, so this is out. We don't do TP meetings in Sheridan or whatever. No.
In the last slide, it said that she was allowed to practice
Yeah.
religion or something. I didn't know
Yeah.
if this was part of
Yeah,
that.
so they do allow sweats inside, right? But not peyote. So this is part of her recovery program, right? Because in the Wellbriety movement, one of the things that reinforces the spiritual belief that there is a unifying life force is the use of certain substances that reinforces that belief. You don't need peyote to feel that. I don't need peyote to see the energy from the trees. But I don't trip about it. Feel the force, Luke. Let go.
I have a question.
All right. Yeah.
Is there AA meetings in jail or
Yes.
prison?
Yes, sometimes. So she keeps a dream journal and has written recovery stories based on her dream experiences. So, these are things that we want to check to see if she's, that her recovery isn't simply not using. Her recovery is also cultural recovery, which will help reinforce continued non-addictive sobriety. So we're stacking the deck. And the fact that she's Native is a bonus. because she was into this. But she didn't really find the native way, ironically, until going to prison in this state where it was allowed. Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. She has also developed what she refers to as a relationship with her death. She says it helps her focus in case she faces death imminently, which makes sense. Don't sugarcoat it. It's a good day to die is not just a Klingon sentiment. It doesn't mean that you're suicidal. It just means your death reminds you you have no time to waste. So focus and concentrate. There are no ordinary moments. Carpe diem. All right, Tony Soprano, 30-something, Italian-American Dewey client. Dual diagnosis, anxiety disorder, alcohol abuser. Mr. Soprano drinks socially and as a coping skill, and is from a family of drinkers. He grew up with bottles of wine with meals finished by mixed drinks, which his family used to self-medicate social anxiety. Now, I'm not throwing out stereotypes, but, you do know people like this, and if you know Italians, they're not the only ones who do this, but lots of folks do. And in Europe, not only Europe, but also here. What you see on TV with the Sopranos, I use this, but, this is real, right? Kids are growing up, and they might start drinking early. Or if they don't start drinking, they at least have inherited a genetic tolerance from people that do. Right? So he's got a tolerance, and so we know that, reading this into the behavior. So he's basically doing that. So he went to see a shrink and a psychologist for what he called panic attacks, and they prescribed an array of pharmaceuticals, including Xanax, Klonopin, Cymbalta, and Abilify.
Not all at once.
Oh
Right?
my God.
All at once, yes.
Right?
Yes, all at once.
Oh
Look,
my gosh.
I don't have to, y'all know me now. I don't have to make stuff up. I do not have to make stuff up. This is a real LCC student,
Oh,
okay? And so, that's...
did he drop out?
No. But he came to see me, right? He was a transfer student, right? So he's going to go to the U of O, etc., right? So he's a transfer student, and he got a Dewey. And technically, I'm a treatment professional, but I'm not really allowed to do treatment here because there's no UAs here, right? Because it's higher ed. I tried to change, but, people would freak out. So, whatever. All right? So, Xanax, Klonopin, Cymbalta, and Abilify. So, these drugs, particularly Abilify, they're pretty hairy. They are. All right? So, you also know that you don't mix them with alcohol. Okay? So it's possible, and I'll just show you this from the slide, right? Though both mental health professionals as well as the dispensing pharmacist emphasize Tony should not mix alcohol with his meds, what do you think you're going to do?
I should mix it.
Yes. Okay? Of course. Why?
Yeah.
Okay, he's an alcoholic, yes. He didn't know that. Well, he doesn't think that because he's thinking his level of drinking is normal, and there was no one to tell him that it wasn't. See the problem now? That's why I talk about induced ignorance addictions. Like, what does your social, if you're raised in a cultural box and you have no reason to question what's in that box until you run into a conflict. Or unless you're raised in a culture that questions boxes in general, which his is not. Okay, so he, of course, continued to drink. Yeah, he's an alcoholic, yeah. Which led, of course, to his DUI. Because, now I want you to be clear about the drug interaction here. Alcohol is so toxic to the body. The body goes on red alert. This is part of the stimulating effect of that particular drug. And the body goes immediately to break it down. That's the liver. The liver creates an enzyme. Okay, enzymes break things down. It's called alcohol dehydrogenase. Anything that ends in an ACE, ASE, is an enzyme. And the name tells you what it does. It breaks off hydrogen groups because basically alcohol is an inverted sugar. You know, little yeasties eat sugar, poop alcohol. That's wine and beer, right? Okay, so how does the body deal with that? Well, this is common enough. We developed a mechanism to deal with it. Break off a hydrogen group from the alcohol, the inverted sugar, and what do you get? First breakdown product is acetaldehyde. Now, acetaldehyde is a couple of hydrogen groups from being formaldehyde, which, if you remember your high school biology and the, embalming fluid and the frogs floating in jars that are dead in formaldehyde, acetaldehyde has that effect in the body. The body really freaks out then.
Is that the pickled effect?
That's how you pickle your liver. Your liver ceases because of alcohol poisoning and continued use, starts having damage and losing function. That's where cirrhosis of the liver comes from drinking. Cirrhosis comes from other things too, but. So he continues to drink, which of course leads to his doing. So what happens with the liver then, with alcohol, is that the liver is required to break down all of the drugs, and because of the presence of alcohol, the liver prioritizes the alcohol first before the other drugs, allowing toxic levels of the other drugs to build up in the bloodstream, increasing the effect of those drugs. So a therapeutic dose of the drug, remember, take 2 of these 3 times a day, 4-hour intervals or whatever. The reason for that is while your liver is breaking down the first dose and maintaining a peak therapeutic level, you take the next dose so that by the time that hits your bloodstream, you're maintaining a whole level of therapeutic drug. Well, alcohol interrupts that. The liver doesn't multitask. Takes the most toxic drug first, breaks that down. So that's why we also look at drug interactions too. Because the drug interactions are not just stopping your heart, they might cause, psychological effects. They might make you crazy. He's taking these because of a panic attack. Now, who knows what the cause of the panic attack is? I surmise, and I'll show you this in the slide, what he's actually experiencing is alcohol withdrawal. Because he's getting anxiety. And if you're taking alcohol for social anxiety, well, actually you could just develop the skill of being sociable without the drug. But most people don't do that. They'll just drink to get, sorry about the ethnic slur if you're Dutch, but this is the phrase that white people use, Dutch courage. Americans, well, Dutch courage, okay, they're drunk, so they're courageous. It's the only way they get courageous is by being drunk. Dutch courage, yeah, okay. Anyway, okay, so he's referred to the center to talk to someone. That was me, right? So, for example, Cymbalta is an antidepressant in a group of drugs called selective serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, SSNRIs. Cymbalta works by restoring the balance. Now, this is drug company propaganda, you can tell. By restoring the balance of certain natural substances in the brain, so serotonin and norepinephrine, which help to improve certain mood problems. Cymbalta is used to treat major depressive disorder and in general anxiety disorder, and is used to treat a chronic pain disorder called fibromyalgia and treat pain caused by nerve damage in people with diabetes. So, for example, the top 10 drug companies make 50% of all profits in the Fortune 500. When a drug company commercial talks about their drug correcting an imbalance, quote unquote, first, has a normal balance actually been medically established? No. Never. People who are insane, when they measure their neurochemistry, they read as normal. Okay? So it is true that the drug increases the normal levels of, whatever, in this case, norepinephrine and serotonin. It does act to increase the levels, but it doesn't mean that you were low to begin with, because there's never been a normal balance established. That's just a marketing term. So they're using a scientific finding and your ignorance of it essentially to sell you something. Now, this doesn't mean you don't take your meds if you need the meds, but because we can't do that. So, Tony Soprano, right? Socially, self-medicated. Questions not often asked: how did you get unbalanced? What put you out of balance? How long will the drug keep you in balance? And will not taking the drug put you out of balance? What can you do to get back into balance without depending on the drug, if that's possible? All right, so I cannot ethically argue people off their meds, but the question remains for us, the trained professionals, how else could you achieve the same effect without the big pharma? Because here's one of the challenges with going off your meds. If the meds are giving you a measure of stability, going off the meds means you're going to be unstable. In fact, withdrawing from the med, a psych med, is going to mean you're going to go crazy for a period of time until you reach the new balance, whatever that was, without the drug. That is, if you can reach the new balance without the drug, because taking the drug might have changed the balance by itself. But here's what normally happens. Client is an adult with a normal, culturally reinforced use of alcohol. Now he's prescribed 4 pharmaceuticals that don't react well with alcohol, shall we say. The physician and the pharmacist said these meds shouldn't be taken with alcohol, but he does. The labels on the meds and the patient insert say they shouldn't be taken with alcohol. He might not meet the diagnostic criteria for alcohol problem, which would be the only reason they medically could tell him to stop. Right? And we'll see what those diagnostic criteria are. If he didn't meet them, then they don't have a basis for telling him to stop. And they probably wouldn't do an alcohol history on him either, anyway, unless that was a problem. Yeah, we drink wine with our meals, and we have mixed drinks afterwards and watch TV and fall asleep. What's the problem?
He was driving.
He was driving on top of the meds that he was prescribed, probably, well, he said from panic attacks, but he could be interpreting the panic attack as, and this is, what I got from him, he simply had stopped drinking for a couple of days because he had a cold and started feeling panic attack. It's probably not a panic attack. It's probably alcohol withdrawal. But he wouldn't think of it that way. And nobody told him that. And none of the docs had done an alcohol history, because only drug counselors do that, right? So one of those meds, Xanax, for example, is physically addictive in less than a week of prescribed use. But again, if you're under a doctor's care, you're not technically an addict from the point of view of the law. You're a patient. Okay, you're an addict or a seeker when you try to acquire controlled substances outside of prescription or beyond prescription use. As long as you're under a doctor's care, well, you're not an addict. Stay within your prescribed use. Okay. I know it's a slippery slope, but that's what we're dealing with. All right, so self-medication comes from the idea that a physician who treats himself has a fool for a patient. And that's if you're trained. If you're a civilian, you're supposed to follow the directives of health professionals, but you don't always. And this is often out of what I refer to as induced ignorance. It's not that you're stupid, it's just that you never thought there would be a problem. Because you weren't taught to question. I'm teaching you to question. Because think there are a lot of him out there? Yeah. Okay, so the dual diagnosis protocol. He's hooked on Xanax after a week or two. And so we don't say he's addicted, and so we'll tell him that. Because we won't tell him he's addicted because it's prescribed, but he can't go cold turkey. That is, from the PDR, the physician's desk reference, abrupt discontinuance. It's a specific medical language. Abrupt discontinuance. Street talk, cold turkey. Without risking withdrawal seizures. That's just from the Xanax by itself. Okay? Now, if you understand that benzodiazepines, so Xanax, Klonopin, etc., they're basically chemical forms of the same drug class that alcohol's in. They're all sedative hypnotics. And they're cross-tolerant, which means tolerance to one is tolerance to all of them. So taking Xanax might be the chemical equivalent in his brain, since there's less drug, but it's a more potent drug than alcohol. It might be the equivalent of taking a couple of stiff drinks without the intoxication. But the body's not fooled. So if he's, used to drinking a bunch of wine, followed with mixed drinks, he's got a certain alcohol tolerance on his own, plus whatever genetic tolerance he has, plus whatever the Xanax is adding to that mix, because he's been drinking on top of it, therefore multiplying his tolerance to a new tolerance level, unpredictably. So combining alcohol with Xanax is like multiplying. It's not 1 + 1, it's 1 × 5, or whatever the factor is. And that's what your new tolerance is, if you've done that over a period of time. So, withdrawal seizures means you go cold turkey from Xanax, then you go into seizures which don't allow you to breathe, and it kills you. Right? So, now it's dual diagnosis, or will be shortly, addicted plus mental illness. The meds are addicting, but he's taking them under a doctor's care, so it's only considered addiction if you do it to yourself and endangering your health, but he is endangering his health with those combinations, which may or may not be going on with the health professional's knowledge.
So is Xanax like a daily thing? When somebody's prescribed Xanax, do
Right.
they take it on a daily basis
Yes.
to keep their levels? So
Right.
when I hear somebody going, oh geez, I'm feeling a little stressed today, maybe I ought to go take a Xanax. What
Yes.
is that doing to their system when they're not taking it as prescribed? They're just like, oh geez.
Well, they might be prescribed it, and they might do it every day. It depends, because if you read the literature on what in the literature, that is the patient's insert, which matches exactly what's in the physician's desk reference, the PDR. Okay? So what it'll say, and I'm quoting from what it says on Xanax. Xanax is an anxiolytic. Okay? Anxiolytic, which means this is anxiety, fear. That means it dissolves fear. So what it says in the PDR with anxiolytics is that normal stresses and strains of life do not usually require anxiolytic therapy. Okay? Meaning that within the literature, they're saying, okay, look, you have the 5 major stressors: divorce, marriage, new job, death in the family, moving, okay? You're going to have a rough patch. So for 3 weeks, we'll give you Xanax to get you through the rough patch, and then you don't need the Xanax anymore. That's the idea, like 40 years ago. But how many docs do you know do that?
A lot of them.
Okay? And a lot of them will basically just throw them out like candy, just like oxys or whatever. No reason why you can't, take them when there's not a rough patch. Well, so what's a rough patch? What's rough? Okay? So what they're doing is prescribing them for constant use, which means if you do that constantly, you'll be physically addicted. Again, PDR, 7 to 10 days of doctor-prescribed use. You'll be physically addicted. Or it says dependence. The old language. Right? And then do not abruptly discontinue. No cold turkey. What they'll do is they'll titrate you down. You heard that word before?
Mm-hmm.
Yes? Who hasn't? Okay. Very important. Titrate. So what titrating is given the dose of the drug, you step down in increments based on the drug's half-life until you're off the drug. Okay, this gives your body time to adjust not being on the drug so that you don't go into cold turkey. You titrate down. So if you're taking 4 Xanax a day or whatever, then take 3 one day, and then take 2 the next day. That's not an actual titration schedule. Okay, take for example methadone. They want you to titrate 10 milligrams a week. Right? Say if you were 200 milligrams a day. So they want you to step down 10 milligrams a week. Okay, no cold turkey. Because cold turkey from methadone takes a while. Anyway. All right? So, titration. All right, so the medical protocol demands, and more importantly, what the client optimally needs is skill building, independent of the pharmaceuticals and other self-medications. The medical protocol is often not what is in the client's best interest, but the interest of other elements of society. We're teaching you to, instead of teaching you to manage your own behavior, thoughts, and emotions, we give you a chemical straitjacket. Because it's convenient. Okay? We need your behavior controlled, and if you can't control it, we need you to remain profitable to someone. So, oh, I know, that's cynical, but let's look at that. You can't control your behavior, we'll lock you up, and somebody's making money from that. So, we could just teach you to control yourself. If you're capable of that. Yeah.
I had a friend who was 23 years in the Air Force, and they retired her. Actually, they discharged her and gave her a medical discharge because the prescriptions that she had to take to do her job eventually drove her to psychosis.
Yeah. Probably amphetamines, among other things.
Amphetamines and then tranquilizers.
Yeah, right. So pills are not skills. You've heard me say that a lot. They really aren't. So if we taught people the skills, along with the pills or before the pills, then they don't need the pills so much. All right? So, the medical protocol for dual diagnosis. Dual diagnosis clients need to abstain from non-prescribed drug use. Okay, since there's no prescription for alcohol, yeah, don't do that. Now, one of the things that happens with duals is they will smoke weed on top of their meds to deal with the side effects from their psych meds. And of course, another complication is now that you have medical marijuana, right now, that's not an AMA recognized practice for that particular thing. We don't know what the reactions would be when you withdraw people from marijuana and their psych meds, or when you have them smoking marijuana and they withdraw from their psych meds, or we haven't studied that.
I understand.
But it happens. So that's what I'm mentioning. It happens with some frequency.
How can they start this legal process and this medical process with marijuana and not have studied that?
Well, we set up another set of rules where you can't do research on an illegal drug.
Well,
We could borrow the Israelis' research. Oh, no, we can't do that. Oh, all right. Yeah, I know. Well, that is often the problem. Our technology, Pete Seeger, bless his heart, basically was vexed about the fact that our technology moves faster than our morality. And that's definitely true with drug technology. So, right, this should be studied. But we ain't. Okay? So in Tony's case, this means alcohol on top of the meds. In his best interest, he needs to develop the coping skills that the meds are substituting for, if at all possible, then to wean himself off the meds. He might not see it that way. Okay, he will find his tolerance for alcohol has grown, both as a result of drinking on top of the meds and continued med use without skill building if his stress increases. Right? So remember, he's taking the meds for panic attacks, which probably alcohol withdrawal might be. That's what I would suspect given his drug combination. So no drinking on top of meds, skill building on top of the stabilizing meds. So we can't argue the client off their meds. If they withdraw, it should be under medical supervision after skill building has taken place, titration. So panic is extreme unreasoning fear. There's not an actual reason to be afraid because there's no actual immediate danger. PTSD or past trauma being triggered or re-stimulated could be a source of the panic. The panic could be a result of body sensations being interpreted as fear when there is no danger. For example, where is the fear being held in the body? What is the sensation in the sensorium? How is it being interpreted? Sensorium? Sensorium is the feeling of being in your body. How does it feel at different states? Thursday, when I was on the edge of having a cold, I could feel like the tickle in the back of my throat without coughing, which grew to a sore throat, which then I handled with cough drops and not completely. Then the congestion and all the other stuff started, et cetera, et cetera. So my body felt achy, felt all this, all right? Sensorium changed. Now I just got the mucus stage and irritation. Well, I guess I'm glad it's not a hemorrhagic flu. All right, so what skills of inner balance can be developed? What mind-body discipline will assist the client? So, for example, what media do they consume? What's in their environment that could be causing it? Media could be a drug, too. Who or what are the successful role models or patterns for their particular circumstance? terms of recovery, that, you know, there are groups of folks that look like what he wants to emulate? Is there a deeper level of sanity he can be restored to? Quoting the 12-step literature, but that's a general question. So I give a simple meditation to people. Told a primary alcohol client to stop using alcohol and don't dodge into using pot, which of course he stopped using alcohol and began using pot because pot was less harmful. Yes, but in terms of your consciousness, the effect is more subtle, which he noticed when he stopped drinking and did an 11-minute meditation. He experienced a benefit while he wasn't on pot. But he got bored and smoked pot, saying his meditation wasn't as powerful as the pot. Well, here's what we know from brain research. Recovery for the brain from drug use, just like itching from a cut is a sign of healing, boredom is a sign of recovery in the brain. And it actually is in boredom. Parts of the brain are waking up. And he's just experiencing them as boredom, or what he interprets as boredom. So we change that feeling. That's why you focus on the meditation. Be able to sit through the boredom till it changes to something else. El Zen koan, a man sitting on a rock contemplates eternity. The stone grumbles. Meaning if you sit on a rock long enough, you can hear it grumble. Or if you sit on a rock long enough, you'll start grumbling. Your mind will distract you. So a Christian mystic once said, when I sit down to meditate, the very stones themselves shout to distract me. So what is addiction in practice? The practice of distraction from an internal process. Addiction recovery involves paying deeper attention and letting go. And that means sitting through the boredom till it changes into something interesting. So that's one of the beginning skills when we talk about pills are not skills, and you want to develop these skills of self-soothing. So part of the biopsychosocial then would be, all right, here's where you're at, here's where you want to be. What is the skill set that I have to get you to start doing that isn't drug-taking behavior that will get you to the place you want to be? And then recommending that. See you next week. Yeah.
Is this on Moodle or
This will be on Moodle.
Okay.
Lane Online. Learn, unlearn, relearn.